In making these investments, though, there's some big questions. Where do you invest? What are the types of projects that you should be looking at? The primary industry sector or primary application that we saw was around reducing energy consumption. Now, average car is estimated costs about 2.6 megawatt hours of energy per vehicle. And that number hasn't changed significantly in over 15 years. So how do you bring that number down in terms of the amount of energy used in manufacturing a car? And that can be across the entire manufacturing process. When we look at waste reduction, on average, a car contains about 1.4 tons of material, and of that, about 900 kilograms of steel, which has a very significant carbon footprint of its own. So how do you minimize the amount of waste there? And that can be through improving, redesigning the processes, improving or changing the actual design of products themselves. Just to give an example from the aerospace industry, in the aerospace industry, they have what's referred to as a buy-to-fly ratio, and that's defined as the amount of raw material used to manufacture a part, a final part. And in the aerospace industry, there are a lot of structural parts where it's reported at 20 to 1. That means it takes 20 kilograms of material to make 1 kilogram of product. So a huge amount of wastage. So how do companies reinvent design and manufacture of their processes to reduce and minimize that? A sort of aligned to that is the issue of recycling. So many companies in the automotive industry already are looking at how to recondition engines, recondition gearboxes, recertify them, and then reuse them. Similarly, what can be done with fabrics, with waste plastic, so they can be recycled and reintroduced. But there's also approaches around different materials and reducing their carbon footprint. I mentioned steel. Steel has a huge carbon footprint of its own. A number of automotive manufacturers, companies like BMW and Mercedes, have already started investing and have planned for vehicles to come out where they'll be using green steel. So steel that is produced without producing carbon dioxide or without a carbon footprint. There's also that one of the areas of considered a low-hanging fruit is that around moving to renewable energy. And there was lots of discussions of that at COP26 about how to shift to renewable energy. But the reality is that since 1990, whilst use of coal has dropped significantly in the industrial sector, most of that replacement has come from gas. The actual growth in renewables has been limited. And we estimate that it's grown only since 1990 from about 7% of industrial energy as a source in the US to about 9% now. So a very small change. So still areas to develop. The final area to touch upon is this issue of tracking and reducing emissions of internal operations. So that's simply being able to monitor emissions as a starting point, but then starting to reduce those emissions. And whilst we talk about internal operations, and that's certainly a key area, increasingly companies are going to have to start thinking beyond just their direct emissions and start looking at the emissions from their supply chain as well. Now, at the moment, when companies considering their emissions, they're primarily considering their direct emissions, and those are typically measured by looking at the fuel combustion and energy demand directly generated at that facility, and also from own transportation. Then there's also what's called Scope 2 emissions that are also accountable, where you look at the purchased energy. But increasingly, there's going to be a focus around what's called Scope 3 emissions, and these are indirect emissions that will come either upstream or downstream. So from your customers, in terms of how they're using your products and the carbon footprint of those products that you produce when they're out and in operation, but also in terms of upstream. So when considering your supply chain, what is the environmental footprint there? And this extends beyond just distribution, beyond waste from operations, but this also starts looking at the footprint of your vendors. So in terms of, we mentioned steel, looking at the carbon footprint of steel being produced that is then being used in vehicles. And increasingly, that is going to be a bigger focus, where when stakeholders are looking at a company's business, it's not just going to be on their direct emissions, but companies will be held to account for their broader supply chain and the efficiencies of their supply chain as well. So this will really create challenges in being able to have an open and transparent supply chain where not only do you know more detail about your suppliers, but they're held to account to certain level sustainability criteria that a company will have.